Good day, everyone. Please be seated. This is panel 2 on resources, and resources is very important as it is at the heart of great power rivalry. And Southeast Asia sits atop substantial reserve of critical minerals. For example, Indonesia holds 22% of global nickel reserves. And Southeast Asia have tried to leverage those resource endowment to secure position in global value chain. However, challenge emerge. The rise of non-nickel battery technology, for example, LFP, have challenged their ambition. The US-China competition has also constrained the room for choice. So to tackle some of the most pressing questions, I am joined by two key speakers, Dr. Eve Warburton, who is research fellow at the ANU Department of Political and Social Change, and also Dr. Trissia WIJAYA, who is a McKinsey research fellow at the Asia Institute, University of Melbourne. And the three questions that this panel try to explicitly tackle would be: how are global and regional geo-economic trends reshaping the production, processing, and supply of Southeast Asia's natural resources? Secondly, to what extent is resource nationalism driven and exacerbated by great power competition, global economic fragmentation, and technological opportunities or constraints? And how is the push for greening in resource sectors influenced by these geoeconomic pressures? So I would like to call the first speaker, Dr. Trissia WIJAYA, to begin her remark. Trissia?
Yes, that's good morning. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much, Emir, for very kind introductions, and special thanks to Evelyn and Nick for kindly inviting me to this event. And it's also such a pleasure to share the stage with a friend, a colleague, Eve, whose work I've been admiring since actually I'm doing my PhD. So it's really great to be here again. So today my presentation, just as what Evelyn said earlier this morning, that within the deepening economic security, we do see a new trend. And one of the new trend that we are going to unpack today is exactly in my housekeeping items today, which is green development in Southeast Asia. First, before starting, it's not moving. So it's not here. I need to. Sorry, I'm not really tech savvy. So I still want to acknowledge all the first people of all the beautiful lands on which I live, work, and celebrate their enduring knowledge and connections to country. I want to honor the wisdom of and pay respect to elders at past and present. So the outline of my presentations today, oops, yes. Is about green development. In recent years, geopolitical gravity and regional development focuses have been increasingly shifted to energy transition efforts. And this dynamic has also created a new condition for green development in Southeast Asia. This region increasingly become a battleground between different paradigms of green developmentalism, which transform patterns of cooperations, conflict between countries, as well as among social and economic groups within the state. So the debate on the rise of green developmentalism in Southeast Asia, however, is far from being precise, given that the very concept of green development is related to rather convoluted or abstract theoretical assumptions and historical experiences. So all of us here probably will talk about green development, energy transition, but none of us really can comprehend and grasp what's actually green development. So today I aim to update and give clearer contours to the idea of green developmentalism. So how do I define them? Um, Perhaps this is quite cheesy, but anyway, Evelyn say I need to speak in a plain language. So I call it the trinity of green developmentalisms, and I divided it into three socio-economic contexts. First, green development, I saw it as an expression of neoliberalisms. that closely align with Chinese-led production network, capital, and technology, and make good use of regional trade agreement. So if emerging body of literature said we are in the era of deglobalization, I would rather say we are more in the era of reglobalization, and China make it happen. And the second one, green development is rather a temporal solutions to crisis situations. I will talk more later. And the third one, green development itself is a new form of politics that we're investigating further. So, so in the past few years, we have seen the remarkable shift of the nature and scope of climate policy in the region. In the past, the necessity for locking in policy falls into technocratic line of inquiry, and in the case of Southeast Asia, as with other developing countries, and Australia also will be familiar with this, that climate efforts were often subordinated to certain measures imposed by multilateral institutions or donors, including USAID, USAID, that actually already gone. These are what we are quite familiar with, which is like capacity building, follow the science approach, such as the pursuit of 1.5 degrees Celsius, community-based program empowerments, environmental sustainability, and so on and so forth. At an extreme case, climate policy has also set to promote degrowth. At least that's what's happening in before COVID time. The agreement, the framework of degrowth is aimed at fundamentally restructuring and radically reducing the energy and material through, even though short-term growth might be a trade-off. But what happened is that right now, the current dynamics of climate or energy policy make the climate or energy policy making are remarkably different. Why? As I show it in the diagram, there has been a disproportionate balance between climate adaptations regime and mitigation, and also increasing militarizations that is paradoxically constituting a precondition for us to access critical minerals rare earth, pivotal for clean technology. So right now, degrowth is no longer gaining traction, but majority of argument here is that growth is possible, but we can also be green at the same time. Um, so here, the energy transition is often driven through the dynamics of green industrial policy, for example, or specific state interventions to promote renewable energy and other related sectors, such as electric vehicles, battery, and if probably will spell out a bit further. And importantly, this green development reactivate key state functions to generate green growth and promote green technology and related infrastructure. So on the left side, the diagram is a recent work by Kennedy Wefa, has found that while technology and workforce impacts dominate discourse of energy transition in the global north, which is more in the clean technology, the adoption of technology, but emerging economies like in Southeast Asia, they often embody a broader framing of sustainable development that envision both economic growth and sustainability. So degrowth is no longer an option here. And the data also resonates with the recent study conducted by Oxford Climate Policy Hub, the right-hand side, which is indicating that transition planning increases sharply in Asia Pacific, including Vietnam, China, Singapore, Australia, Indonesia, Thailand, shortly after COVID time. And the notion of transition itself is a convoluted term encompassing coal phase out, but also expanded extractivism at the same time, such as nickel, lithium production, rare earth mining, and so on and so forth. So what this data tell us about it, this data really surfaced to tell us one important thing. So green development implies the shifting aim of state intervention from protecting domestic markets into managing the integration of domestic companies and key sectors in the regional chains of clean tech. But, of course, with special linkage to China. Why is it special linkage to China? So, in my argument, I argue that green development is closely intertwined with China's ongoing capitalist crisis. So this is not only about China would like to invest over capacity issue, but it's much more complex than that. And so it's not only about ASEAN, China plus one, or the efforts to mitigate any risk from the Trump eclectic policy. So the current moment, at the current moment, China ongoing capitalist crisis, we can find a new expression of the capitalist crisis in China that is often referred to as the new three. The new three here refer to EV, battery, and solar panel. And this new three has become a key channel linking China to Southeast Asian economies. So as the graphics show, I tried to compile some data from National Bureau of Statistics of China. So the data tell us everything. So property and real estate investment has fallen by almost 10% compared to last year. And during the COVID period, it declined by nearly 18%. With real estate prices dropping, the impact on Chinese households whose wealth is heavily concentrated in property and real estate have been severe. So unemployment is rising and wages remain stagnant, and China just continue to experience deflation. So it's against this backdrop that the new three, which have long been embedded in China national development plans, gain renewed momentum. So it's not just happening all of a sudden, but there is specific moment which is ongoing capitalist crisis that trigger the the national development plan that has been executed since 10 years ago. So as the diagram illustrates, there has been a sharp expansion in sectors central to the new three. So for example, the mining and processing of non-ferrous metal ores, that's actually referred to rare earth, and the manufacturing of automobile and electronic machinery, which actually refer to EV industry and also solar panel included as well. So this sector continued to expand in 2023, but interestingly, it began to slow in 2024, which leads actually to my next point after this. So it's clear to us that while growth in China is decelerating, we observe rapid increases in production and investment in key Southeast Asian markets such as Thailand and in several emerging economies in Latin America. So here we go. So as you can see here, I also try to compile and group relevant HS codes, 6 digits, that fall into respective new three domains. The new three one, battery, EV, and solar panel. Of course, if as you can see the three graphics here, I cannot present all the Southeast Asian countries trade flow, but I just focus on six countries that are significant to Chinese investment. And the current data is still very fragmented, but I try my best to group relevant XH codes that I think fall into respective these three domains. So from there, we can try to assess the flow of goods and trades from China to key countries in Southeast Asia. The key takeaway here is that the growing trade in goods are linked to the ongoing capitalist crisis in China that I just mentioned, the overcapacity. So basically, excessive competition in China has led to shrinking corporate profit margins across multiple sectors, including electric vehicles, solar panel, lithium batteries, steel, cement, etc. So this is also what actually mainstream media and also the Chinese government themselves coin as involution. So involution marked by overcapacity, price wars across various sectors, and entrenched deflation. And Chinese solar industry has also been in the crosshairs of this anti-involution drive, as massive level of overcapacity and price wars have led to losses in the solar panel industry. So meanwhile, Chinese 2024 wafer cell module capacity alone is sufficient to meet annual global demand through to 2032. So put simply, the current volume of Chinese production for solar panel is actually enough to supply the global demand for solar panel at least for the next 7 years. So And also more importantly, according to data from LSEG, covering 33 listed automakers headquartered in China, the sector median net profit margin actually fell to just 0.83% in 2024 from 2.7% in 2019. So the profit margin is quite thin in this regard. So as a result, this perpetuated what happened in the early years of Belt and Road Initiative. Yeah, it's almost 10 years. Oh, it's already 10 years ago, actually. So in that sense, Southeast Asia become a market, a source of input, new transshipment like Indonesia and Vietnam, and making Southeast Asian country as an intermediate destination to ship goods to another destination, but also with deeper supply chain linkage with clean tech industry in China. So this is what make it different from what happened in BRI 1.0 in mid 2010, that was much focused on infrastructure and real estate. Okay, the next one is that um, I also try to run the data uh, on the Southeast Asian regulation. So um, this is also led me to the arguments that why this kind of investment is actually considered as a way to solve temporary crisis within Southeast Asian economies. So as Evelyn also said earlier, not Indonesian only. So Southeast Asian country, their security is their economic. So this is why it's very important to um, leverage on Chinese investment, including trade with China as well, to solve temporary profitability crisis within the Southeast Asian economy as well. So the scope and the focus of Chinese investment in Southeast Asia shows strong linkage with the trend in Chinese fixed asset investment that I showed earlier, particularly the decreasing number of investment in solar panel. So so just now, there is a decreasing number of investment in China in terms of EV and solar panel, but actually it has been increasing in Thailand, Vietnam particularly on solar panel, and Indonesia as well for the battery that is currently under construction. So at the same time, this is also part of a solution for the Southeast Asian government, because at the time, especially 3 years ago, the COVID hit hard, and the government debt to GDP ratio in Southeast Asia surged from 40% to 57% over the period of 2015 to 2021, partly due to substantial fiscal spending to mitigate socio-economic issues related to the COVID-19 pandemic. So this is the very moment when they need to maintain the healthy of the balance of the payment. So here I compile all the official documents, but not including derivative. This is just a very rough data related to green industrial policy on the new three, and group them into 5 different categories. So data quality in this area actually is not that great. They're very preliminary, but it seems to fit with other some pieces of data and trajectory of Chinese investment in Southeast Asia, alongside its overcapacity issue. For example, as you can see, the red circle indicates the most dominant policy themes in a given country. So for example, in Indonesia, what dominant is critical mineral and resources, and this is linked to what Evelyn also said earlier, is because Indonesia dominate the upstream value chain, and this is also where China can also leverage on the increasing state intervention on that area, particular area. Whereas in Vietnam, it's also linked to what Dr. Fu said earlier, uh, about the trade and downstream policy, how Vietnam also become a new hub for the production. And mostly industrial policy are concentrated on that area. So here we see how if one dig into Chinese investment into 3 sectors in different countries, we can also see the largest concentration of capital, including Chinese capital, in what area and what kind of policy supported um, that Chinese investment. But an important point to note here is that um, it is still far. It's still a wishful thinking to see whether Southeast Asian economies really can push industrialization through this new tree. Why? Because practically speaking, fiscal costs of industrial policy relative to GDP remain low. So roughly around 0.2% of GDP. Well, for comparison, the equivalent fiscal cost of industrial policy in China is about 4.4% GDP per year. So that's how great China in using their fiscal measure to push for industrializations. Well, there are still lack of aggregate data in Southeast Asian countries, of course, but looking at the type of incentive and subsidy here, such as green financing instrument, tax holiday, subsidy, it's still clear to me that some of these subsidies may be temporary or just tied to stimulus program or pandemic relief or something that are linked to the government effort, social policy, but not permanent industrial strategy or coherent industrial strategy as yet, particularly in the case of Indonesia. Okay, and and the next one is actually looking green development as a new form of politics. As I mentioned earlier, involution in China nowadays, the trap of price war and being competitive. So even though China right now is already so hegemonic in terms of clean tech, critical mineral production, but we should not forget the fact that the key for China to remain competitive is the price. It's because China can press the price, and this is also why it become the issue right now. So the so-called anti-involution campaign has been sparked by overcapacity among Chinese manufacturers. So this is just a classic mercantilist policy, but actually long last and affect the region quite tremendously. So those cuts, price cuts, have prompted price war across various sectors that are actually raising concern deflation that might become entrenched and hinder efforts to stabilize Chinese economy. So this anti-involution concept is now also linked to the country pivot from poverty-driven growth to an industrial complex encompassing global manufacturing that is now tilting towards Southeast Asian production network, and also has seen more resources that is being invested, also resources being exploited in Southeast Asian economy. So it's really a race to the bottom. But this bring a new spillover in Southeast Asia and also give shape to new forms of politics, authoritarianisms, populisms, or new militarized regimes in various way. So, for example, in Myanmar right now slowly becoming vital green energy frontiers and play central role in the race for dual-use technology. So over the past few years, Chinese has been so reliant on Myanmar, particularly on rare earth metals required to produce its strategic nutri. But also this nutri, not only nutri, but this rare earth mineral is also important for dual-use technology, which is for defense equipment as well. So the thing is that this expanded extractivism is not only about destructing environment, but the thing is that it's also indirectly finance the war effort of armed groups in Myanmar. So it sustains authoritarian politics in different way. But in Indonesia, there's also different kind of emerging politics that I will explain after this. But the thing here is that even though Southeast Asia, as we discussed earlier this morning, Southeast Asian countries tend to be more opportunist. But even though they tend to be more opportunist, it doesn't mean that China will put all the egg into all the basket of Southeast Asia. They still need to compete, and the necessity to compete, it means that they need to be competitive in terms of price as well, because Chinese concern is more about which country that can reduce the production cost, because for China, after all, price is the input, the key input for their production network. So, so as you can see here, I also try to run some data and from Business and Human Rights Resource Center, and it's found that there are 127 allegations of abuse linked to the mining of minerals essential for the energy transition between 2010 and 2024 in the Asia Pacific region. And Indonesia, Myanmar dominate the graphs. And more than 500 rare earth mining sites now operating along key tributaries of the Mekong, Salween, and Irrawaddy rivers, as well as in Indonesia. There's also many cases related to environmental violations, indigenous right violations, tribal right violations that I reckon that this should be linked to the nickel smelter, and also attack on human rights defenders. Um, so, oops. Oh, okay. So this is what I mentioned about Indonesia. We see the emerging form of authoritarian politics in this regard. This is drawn on my just my newly published paper in Journal of Contemporary. Oh no, not that one. Sorry, Journal of Journal of Contemporary Asia. Sorry, I mix up things. Journal of Contemporary Asia. So I argue that Chinese nickel investment in Indonesia also contribute, even though not a single variables, but contribute to an emerging form of authoritarian politics in the country. So at a time of rising logistic costs, especially from the Chinese end, the Indonesian government has continued to entice Chinese investor by positioning the country as a cost-efficient production base, especially for nickel intermediary products. Whether the industrial upgrading materialized or not is beyond the scope of my presentation today. I'm also still looking into the data. But what is clear is that Indonesia's urgency to address its political crisis and fiscal constraint has resulted in the condensation of neoliberal values and authoritarian lures with little understanding of a long-term industrial policy design, to be honest. So this is kind of more like reactive strategy from the Indonesian government to make good use of Chinese nickel investment to increase the balance of payment. So through this balance of payment, it can be transferred for fuel subsidy that majority middle class and lower middle class desperately needed, especially after the COVID hit hard the economy. So balance of payment contribute to increasing state income that can be used for fuel subsidy. And that's how important it is, even though at the end of the day, authoritarian politics has become one of the political foundations that push for that counted as a preconditions for global energy transition. So my key takeaway here is that green developmentalism's embeds unrelenting pressures on Southeast Asian countries, regardless they they have capacity to exploit opportunity, but still there are big constraints and challenges. Somehow they only serve as transit hubs to reroute goods to the US without any significant structural transformation happening within the state. And then second, somehow these countries still serve as market instead of producer. Is one of the undeniable fact actually. And the third one, investment. Um, there's still a growing niche in clean tech industry where some Southeast Asian countries like Vietnam and Thailand start capturing a larger share of the production. So, but the storyline here is more like what we lament about that despite these amazing opportunities, this has in turn necessitated a harshly competitive environment for Southeast Asian countries to effectively exploit the geopolitical opportunities. And that's why the abuse and human rights violations persist. And we also need to link Southeast Asian green development to China trajectory of capitalist accumulations that has seen the assertion of party leadership over resource allocations on the new three, EV, battery, solar. So if we talk about new three as one of economic statecraft of China, but we also cannot neglect the fact that this new three itself is also a key foundation for Chinese party leadership nowadays. So this also counted as part of Chinese security regime. And the last but not least for Australia, what I would like to emphasize here is that it will be better for Australia to better understand the nature and form of green development in Southeast Asia and start to contextualize it beyond the global north and south divide. The thing is, yes, this is green development in Southeast Asia should be understood beyond technocratic point of view or a mere institutional problem. So what happened in the current development is different from what took shape in the Cold War period or early post-Cold War era, where a development project was often reduced into technical issue, capacity building problem, or the lack of capacity building, sustainable empowerment, blah, blah, blah. But understanding Southeast Asia means understanding the depth and the breadth of its form and scope of industrial policy, trade, and economic cooperation. So the depth here, including relations between the state and capital, military capital relations, capital and labor, and contradiction between these variables. Breadth involving largest transformations of geopolitical economy, including contradiction within China and the West. And the last but not least, this is my favorite phrase, the Goodhart laws. A measure stop being a good measure once it become a target. And this is what Chinese economy has been relying on, the target. And nowadays, we also see how Southeast Asian economies are obsessed with target, but somehow they forgot and overlook a socio-environmental impact that should not be a trade-off for green development. Okay, I will stop here. Thank you. I don't know how to. Thank you.
Oh, Trissia. Right, good morning, everyone. Thank you very much to Evelyn and to Nick for the invitation. Thank you for your kind words, Trissia. Made me feel a little old that you were reading my work as a PhD student. I was going to say that Trissia is a rising star in political economy of Southeast Asia, but I think her star has risen. So it's also an honor to be on a panel with you. So I'm going to be talking about the normalization of resource nationalism and the politics of shifting supply chains. Full disclosure, I might be the only person at this conference that is not an international relations expert, nor do I work on security very much. I'm a political scientist and I work on comparative political economy. So I'm bringing more of a kind of domestic political lens to some of the questions that are being posed for this panel. So these were the questions. I've edited them a tiny bit that we were set by Evelyn and Nick to talk about. And I've structured my presentation around these questions. So the first one is, how are global and regional geo-economic trends changing the way that resource-rich countries produce their natural resources? And the answer to this question will surprise, well, I'm framing it in terms of what I call the normalization of resource nationalism. So the argument is that these geoeconomic trends that we've been talking about, the competition between the US and China, reshaping patterns of resource governance in a way that is leading to the normalization of resource nationalism, in the sense that this is a set of policy prescriptions that I'll explain in a moment that historically have been very common in the global south, in resource-rich countries in the global south. But they are becoming more normal in the global north, in the resource-rich countries like America, Canada, and I'll be talking about Australia today as well. So that's the sort of what question, I guess. The why. So to what extent do great power pressures exacerbate resource nationalism? I think the answer sort of in the question. Well, they do. So China's domination of what we're going to be talking about today's critical mineral supply chains has motivated this really dramatic nationalist pivot in the global north, where we're now seeing wealthy resource-rich countries emulating, and I want to emphasize this, the really once maligned nationalist restrictions that were common in or nationalist policy styles that are more common in the global south. And the third question, and I've sort of manipulated this question a little bit for my own interests, the question is, how are these forces or trends playing out in our region? Because I'm describing here really global trends. And I wanted to describe, or I want to present to what I think are really archetypal cases of resource nationalism in the south and in the north. The first one is Indonesia. We've talked about it a little bit on and off throughout the conference today. But also I want to talk about Australia as a case that has kind of is undergoing this a global north country that is undergoing this nationalist pivot. And I'm going to be doing that using sort of the nickel as a kind of portal into these wider trends. And again, because I'm a domestic political scientist primarily, what I want to do is to think about what are the kind of domestic political conditions that are sort of through which all of these geo-economic rivalries are sort of filtered through. What is it about the domestic political conditions in a country like Indonesia that have in fact enabled a much more successful implementation of resource nationalist policies, whereas a country like Australia is in fact struggling to implement almost exactly the same sorts of resource nationalist policies. So first of all, for anyone who hasn't spent a lot of time thinking about resource nationalism like I have, a quick definition of terms. So in the broader sense, resource nationalism is an attempt by state and non-state, or it describes attempts by state and non-state actors to really just exert more control over natural resource industries. And I'm going to be shamelessly self-referential here. This is a definition that I came up with in a book that I wrote a couple of years ago. I think about resource nationalism as having sort of two different imperatives. On the one hand, we can think about resource nationalism as having a localizing imperative. So these are describing efforts to reduce foreign ownership and foreign intervention in natural resource industries. And then we can think about it as also having this industrializing and/or industrializing ambition. So here we're talking about interventions that try to exert control over supply chains so that resource-rich countries like Indonesia, like Australia, that have spent or whose economies depend primarily on the export of raw commodities, so the kind of dig and ship, extract and export sort of model. These are interventions that try to change that model and try to industrialize or engage in resource-based industrialization. So we're using raw commodities as a feed-in for a higher value industry. And that's what we'll be talking about today. Let's keep up with my own slides here. Anyone who, I don't know about anyone else, but whenever I open up LinkedIn now, I'm like assaulted with a barrage of op-eds and hot takes and articles on critical minerals. So, but for those of you who aren't in that situation, what is a critical mineral? So it depends on which country you're in. These critical mineral lists vary a little bit from country to country. Why? Because a critical mineral is simply a mineral that has been defined as vulnerable for some reason. It could be that it's hard to find. It could be that there's limited deposits, but it could also be that it's just highly concentrated in one country or one region. And so the supply chain for these minerals is vulnerable in some sense. And we're talking about them a lot at the moment because critical minerals are the minerals that we need or that are used in green energy technologies. And so they have become more critical and have become more politicized, as I've been talking about throughout throughout today. And so, as I said, these sort of the list of critical minerals, oh good, I haven't been timing myself. The list of critical minerals varies a little bit from country to country, but usually you will find these sorts of minerals on a country's critical mineral list. Why? Because they are used in batteries, various types of batteries for electric vehicles. And, you know, from all the biggest sort of carbon emitters around the world, the industry that tends to be responsible for most of the carbon emissions is in fact the transport sector. So that's why there's been a really big emphasis on EVs as a part of the green transition globally. And so these are the minerals that are needed to go into the batteries that we use in electric vehicles. Okay, that was just concept terms, making sure we're on the same page. So the first question for the panel was, how are global and regional geo-economic trends changing the way resource-rich countries produce and or govern their key natural resources? And my argument is that geo-economic trends are leading to this process of normalizing resource nationalism. So as I said before, resource nationalism is something that we think about as really being a tool of the global south. And what do I mean by the global south? Well, these are, of course, countries that are late industrializers or haven't industrialized. They're lower middle income countries. They also tend to be countries that are post-colonial. And we're talking here about resource-rich countries in the global south. And so given that sort of a history and that sort of economic identity, these are countries where there have been long histories of anti-foreign mobilization around the resource industries and really broad-based support, often across the entire political spectrum and with a lot of public support too, for the kinds of interventions that would reduce foreign ownership, but it would also the kinds of interventions that would support or that are supportive of a transformation of their country's economy from one that sits at the bottom of global trade hierarchies, that sits at the where they're always sort of, you know, exporting cheap commodities to the more industrialized economy, wealthier economies in the global north. And so this is actually from 2025. This is data from the OECD on export restrictions of industrial raw materials. And so the red dots are countries that have export prohibitions on raw materials. So some kind of export ban or export restriction or export quota, that's the orange dots, or an export tax is the sort of yellow dot. And the green dot is where you have no restrictions. And it's a very, very clear pattern where it's the countries of the global south in Asia, the African continent, Latin America, where you see much more red and orange and yellow, and the green in the global north, including the very resource-rich countries of the global north. So it's a tool that both traditionally, but actually and still today, where the most restrictive or most, I guess, radical interventions that try to that try to build out industrial infrastructure around commodities, that's really only happening, or has really only traditionally happened, in the global south. But the global north is undergoing this sort of pivot. And while we're not seeing, we're seeing this dramatic U-turn in Western policy-making circles, including here in Australia, adopting both the rhetoric and the policy style that, as I said, is more common in the South. But instead of using these more radical restrictions like export prohibitions or export quotas to try and drive investment into the midstream or the upstream of these industries, what we're seeing is a much more common policy intervention is subsidies. And so we're seeing this really big increase in subsidies for critical minerals globally. So this is a database that collects not just, it's got global trade alerts, so it's kind of documenting over time the number of both policies but also direct subsidies to mining companies that exist all around the world. And I don't have time in the presentation to disaggregate this data, but what this data is really telling us is that for the country with the most subsidies is China. That would be no surprise. But especially this sort of really dramatic increase in subsidies, public subsidies for critical minerals globally since the COVID period, really, since, well, 2019, 2020. That's coming from the US, it's coming from the EU, it's coming from Australia, in fact, as well, and it's coming from Canada. And this is just a very brief list of some of the policy, the kinds of policy architecture that's been introduced just in recent years in these countries, really to try and channel public money into the opening up of new mines and also the opening up financing for mineral processing and refining, so the midstream of these industries. And with the effort, the long-term effort really, or the long-term goal of eventually building out entire manufacturing supply chains onshore, so in these countries, in these global north countries, for green technologies. And this was something that Trissia was, of course, talking about just now. So that was the what question. The question is why. So to what extent are great power pressures exacerbating resource nationalism or what I would call the normalization of resource nationalism? And of course, it's key. I think that one of the people in the sort of, her name is Thea Francas, she works on extraction. And I think she was probably the first person to come up with this really nice term to describe the kind of the forces, the dual forces that are motivating this nationalist turn in the global north. And that's what she calls the sustainability security nexus. So we've been talking about economics and security nexus today, but this is a much more specific kind of nexus. And sustainability here is the green transition. So the imperative to capture global supply chains and mineral supply chains, rather, that we need for green technologies. But then the security nexus is, of course, this intensifying great power competition and rivalry between the US and China for these supply chains. So really, COVID-19 really laid bare the fragility of global supply chains. And it was really from this point that we get this sort of chorus of security and international relations experts sounding the alarm about China's actually very long-standing control of these mineral supply chains. So China's market power, downstream dominance in these supply chains is now seen, and again, quite suddenly, as a major and proximate risk for the West. And I think it's worth just underscoring, I know many people in this room would be aware of this, but it's not as though China did this as an act of aggression. You know, the West willingly handed over this part of the mineral supply chain decades ago. The global north didn't want what were very, very dirty smelting and refining facilities onshore, and have, until very recently, were very comfortable with these supply chain arrangements. But as tensions have risen between China and the US, as China has on odd occasions, not very common, but there have been these occasions where it has decided to use its dominance of particular minerals and rare earths in particular as a weapon, as a trade weapon, that means now that we have all of this support for trying to radically reorganize supply chains and bring some of this, some of the mid and downstream onshore. And this is just a graph. People have probably seen many different versions of this sort of figure, just showing you that the processing, that sort of midstream of the supply chain for all of these very important critical minerals, it's pretty much all done in China. Except Indonesia is obviously the interesting case study here. So how is this all playing out in our region? As I said, as I sort of foregrounded at the beginning, there are these two really archetypal cases here, right here in our region, Indonesia being one and Australia being the other. And I'm going to use this story of nickel to sort of demonstrate in fact, the advantage that a country like Indonesia in the global south has at this particular moment, and the disadvantages or the struggles that Australia is having trying to bring processing onshore. So it's funny, part of my PhD research 10 years ago was on Indonesia's nickel industry, and I was told at that time that was very, very niche. But now everyone knows about Indonesia's nickel, and because it has been remarkably successful at taking control of its supply chain and attracting investment to build out a nickel smelting and refining industry. And when I say success here, the caveat, there's obviously a huge caveat. And, for a different audience and a different presentation, I could talk much more about the really significant externalities, both environmental and labour, that the building out of these nickel smelting and these huge industrial parks has had. And we can talk about that in the Q&A if we like. But if we're measuring success here in terms of the success of an industrialising form of resource nationalism, then Indonesia has done a really remarkable job. So, basically Indonesia introduced this export ban in 2014. And I do want to, perhaps just reflect a little bit on how sceptical the global north was, how incredibly critical multilateral financial institutions were, foreign governments, US, there was just a huge effort went into writing reports telling Indonesia this was a terrible economic idea, from USAID, including DFAT, including a whole range of other sort of multilateral financial institutions. And Indonesia ignored them all. And even though it was a long and slow process, Indonesia did indeed manage to ban the export of raw nickel ore, and it is now controlling 62% of refined nickel output. And of course, as Trissia has pointed out and others would know, this is the engine of this downstream growth has been investment from China. People have explained Indonesia's success in a lot of ways, and even though there was all of that skepticism 10 years ago, it's so interesting now to read the commentary on this, because it's as though everyone knew that Indonesia would do this all along, and all the commentary is about, well, of course Indonesia could do it because it had all these ingredients that allowed it to dominate this one particular mineral. But I think it's worth, what I thought I would do slightly differently is just to use the words of the people who've been involved in this policy in Indonesia, drawing on interviews from different points along the line, how Indonesians and policymakers have explained their success. So one is really obvious, that, the key to being able to do this is dominating nickel. So it already was a big player in terms of the export of raw nickel ore, primarily to China. So switching off the tap could, in many ways, in other ways that it couldn't do with other sorts of minerals, would motivate investment downstream. So that's one element. The export bans. So this is actually an interview from 2017, right when Indonesia was was relaxing the ban, but the ban came back in 2020. And so basically what this bureaucrat said was that we knew investors wouldn't come unless you actually have a ban, unless you make it final. And because nickel was actually a small part of Indonesia's economy, really, in the grand scheme of things, in terms of Indonesia's broader kind of growth model, they knew that the short-term pain would be worth the long-term gain. And then the agglomeration strategy. So one senior advisor who was key in designing these policies said that the big game changer was that we could create these zones, these economic zones, these industrial parks, with different sets of rules, price floors, tax holidays, cheap energy, and different environmental rules, i.e. very poor environmental rules and regulations. And this changed the game and really increased investment. The willing partner story, we all know this story, but the quote is quite an interesting one, that they said the Chinese never meddle in our internal policies. They didn't criticize the ban. They didn't take us to court, as some of our other trading partners did, or protest the ban. They just found a way to work with us. It was a win-win situation, as Trissia has also explained on the Chinese side. And for me, as a domestic political economist, this is really key and really interesting, and Trissia touched on it too, that this is an interview with a low regional head in one of these mining hubs. There's no resistance from local governments. We don't get enough, even though we don't get enough tax from these industries. There's no protest by labour groups, even though there's problems. There's no environmental protest either, even though there's all these problems. Why? Because everything is controlled by the centre. So key to being able to this really sort of eye-watering pace of industrial development in Indonesia has been its capacity to depoliticise these zones and to really control politics. Indonesia's democracy is relatively weak, it's declining in terms of its quality, and the state apparatus has been used, especially in these economic zones, to suppress opposition. And so these are all the ingredients of success. Now, what has the result been? Australia has really been the loser. And Indonesia has been the winner, at least if we're talking about nickel. So Indonesia's success, of course, meant that the global markets were flooded with cheap nickel, and that really devastated Australia's own nickel industry. So by the end of 2024, 7 of 9 of Western Australia's nickel mines have closed or paused production. And this includes a couple of our smelters. Canada had a similar response as well. The first response from Australia was actually very knee-jerk. You know, they started calling Indonesia's nickel very dirty, and that what we could do is we could have this kind of premium on nickel, green nickel here coming from Australia. But that really hasn't worked. And as you can see, in terms of the kilogram, in terms of the volume of the nickel that we now export, it's really next to nothing compared to 10 years ago. And so for Australia, and this is partly motivated by the experience of nickel, but of course it is motivated by all these broader anxieties about China's dominance of a whole range of critical mineral supply, processing and refining facilities, that Australia has now got these what I call downstream dreams. So this is a quote, from Madeleine King. So we must look to grow our downstream capabilities in areas of competitive advantage and do more processing and refining onshore. This could have been a quote from Joko Widodo from 2014. It's exactly the same kind of wording. And to that end, we've now seen this flurry of interventions that are publicly subsidizing. So, you know, money from the public purse, subsidizing not necessarily new smelting projects and mining projects, but just trying to keep the existing ones afloat. And so there's been this huge emphasis, as I said, on subsidies rather than restrictions, all with this nationalist goal of disentangling ourselves from China. So Indonesia's model obviously relies on tens of billions of both private but also state bank investment from China, but we have to rely on the public purse. This is just, I'm not going to go into details, it's just some examples. And some of these projects that are being sort of lifted up, including nickel projects, nickel cobalt projects, but this includes a lot of support for rare earths as well, which I'm not talking about today, and copper as well. And I know it's still early days, but you get really different sort of responses depending on what you're reading, or analyses rather, depending on what you're reading. You can have the really bullish, really positive sort of story that Australia is really going to be the next big, green manufacturing hub. They're going to use all of our resources to do what China has done. But then you also get the more sobering analyses. And I think one that just came out last month from the RBA is probably the more realistic one. The Australian government policy, while it aims to develop Australian producers' involvement in downstream activities, its processing and refining capabilities are really going to grow modestly all the way until 2040, and that really we need to continue to rely on China, Indonesia, and Malaysia. In other words, we need to rely on our Asian partners. Instead, what we're doing is developing these critical mineral deals with the US, our kind of traditional security partner, when in fact economically it's probably more feasible and more commercially viable to look to Malaysia, China, and Indonesia. And indeed, the only rare earth refinery that we have developed recently, Australian company has developed recently, is Lynas, and it's in Malaysia. So the conclusion though here is actually, I want to emphasize the politics of all this. I think I've got just enough time. So why does Indonesia advance at speed in something like this while Australia struggles? And of course, there are lots of factors. The most obvious one is that it's just more expensive to do it here. You know, we have expensive labor, we have expensive energy. But I kind of want to think about a political economy framing that can capture that, but that can also capture the politics of why a country in the global south is more agile and more able to reorganize value chains in a way that a country like Australia might not. And we can think about the sort of historical political economy of resources in Australia versus Indonesia. So Australia is this market-driven extract and export model, a growth model that's like really deeply entrenched in how we grow as a country economically. And it means we're limited in terms of how we can entice and not really discipline capital to drive it downstream. Using public subsidies and public funds to prop up and build these industries is a slow process. Perhaps it's going to work. But I think politically, we are very different countries as well. And how long can we continue to publicly subsidize, people like Gina Rinehart and Twiggy Forrester? Is that politically palatable? And crucially, one of the very few actors that's capable of working with us to achieve this goal is the one that we are trying to exclude, which is China. Indonesia, on the other hand, has this really long history as a country of the global south of experimenting with statist industrial policy. It has a kind of, as I said, across the political spectrum, support for this and public support too, and a willingness to discipline capital through the things like export bans. It has a flexible growth model where minerals are important, but not necessarily the backbone of the economy, and a very, very ultimately, as we know, pragmatic relationship with China, where it sees China as the partner of choice for the reasons that I've described. And so I think, and what I'm trying to say here is that it's not as though the global north won't be able to achieve some of these goals, but I think as putting on a domestic political economy lens, we see why there are so many struggles ahead for Australia, and why we see, at the moment at least, kind of a yawning gap between rhetoric and reality. And let me leave it there. I think just on time.
All right. Thank you very much for the two speakers. I'm going to take around 20 minutes-ish for Q&A, and I know this will run towards the lunch time, so feel free to but I would like to give opportunities, yeah, for questions, because the two speakers really did offer some very interesting insights. And in fact, I would like to abuse this privilege to kickstart the first question before I open to the floor, which is to Trissia. And I'm very intrigued by this new tree, the EV, solar and battery. And I was wondering, to what extent has this new tree been captured by Southeast Asia, and how they have readjusted their domestic strategy? And I was also intrigued by your data, because it shows that Indonesia and Malaysia in battery and manufacturing receive quite a lot of investment from China, while actually Thailand and Vietnam import a bit more. So what have been some of the strategy or thinking on why China picked these two countries specifically for this specific sector? Shall we open to the floor, maybe? Yes.
So I have a question for Eve, actually. You mentioned you might talk about externalities. So, yeah. I dipped my toe in critical minerals before COVID, and I remember a selling point was that if Australia dug them out, that it would be cleaner. And I remember when I wrote that, someone said, Australia's environmental laws aren't that good. And I thought, well, it's all relative. But then in the context of our environmental laws being reformed and people are saying they haven't worked for 10 years, I just wondered if you could talk about the politics of that.
Shall we have one more, and then we will open another one, maybe from that side?
I'm from the AMU Law School. I have a question also for Lee. I was wondering, when you mentioning these Chinese investing in Indonesia, are they pure investment as financial investor, meaning that just lending money to the domestic operation, or they're actually equity investment where the Chinese actually went there, run the company, and yeah, so I think that they have different implications in terms of.
Okay. Okay, thanks, Amir, for the questions. Yeah, I don't see Pak Acho here. I still remember Pak Acho Arianto Panturu. I still remember that 2 years ago I met Pak Acho in Jakarta, and we are complaining about the unrealistic, wishful thinking of Jokowi government at the time. So you asked me what trigger or what factors Chinese consider in their investment decision, whether they should invest X in Malaysia, Y in Thailand, Z in Malaysia, in Vietnam, something like that. But yeah, I still remember, I can recall 2 years ago, I had a conversation with Pak Acho, and Pak Acho said, if anything, Indonesia just want to control everything. from XYZ, and they just want to control value chain. So actually, when we also recall in early 2021, when COVID hit, and then many infrastructure projects in Indonesia also stalled, and at the time, Chinese supposed to build a new industrial park in Kayan, North Kalimantan, but until now, it's just left in limbo. But there was also remarkable shift in terms of Indonesian economic diplomacy with China at the time, with nickel downstreaming come into the picture. But our government at the time actually proposed, what if China invests in everything from downstream, also building battery precursor to the EV assembly, which is impossible, of course. But when it comes to Chinese, as I mentioned earlier, Chinese domestic economy, the way they survive and also ensure their profitability is, of course, still linked to the imperative to be cheap and competitive. So for Indonesian case, to be honest, it's not only Indonesia who produce nickel. We also have New Macedonia, which produce nickel. But why Chinese tend to reorient and concentrate their investment in the nickel upstream sector is because Indonesia offer cheap, low-cost productions. And also why Malaysia, of course, there's also in certain like semiconductor or solar panel concentrated in Vietnam, in Malaysia, is because there are also certain elements that Malaysia can meet, but Indonesia cannot. So I think when it comes to China, I know some people thinks there's like geostrategic influence balancing. But based on the data, I reckon that for China, it's more about quantity than quality. So how to make sure that profit margin, even though it's not really huge margin, but at least it's not so thin. So that's one of the consideration, I think.
Okay, yeah. Negative externalities. Yeah, so as I mentioned, one of the ways in which Indonesia was able to so quickly attract huge amounts, relatively quickly, huge amounts of investment and Chinese companies to entice them to come and operate in Indonesia was through relaxing environmental regulations in general, but particularly at these sites of extraction. And the results have been very obvious, and the Indonesian government has acknowledged this and is aware of this, and is at least rhetorically saying that there's going to be a shift in terms of how they deal with tailings, huge impacts on waterways and the like. Deforestation is another problem, but they're not really talking about how they're going to fix that problem. And what Australia has said is, well, we have much more firm environmental regulations. Our nickel is green, and we should have some kind of price premium, for Australian nickel. And that hasn't gone off because, in the end, the consumers of nickel for EV battery development actually don't really care about the green profile of this commodity. They care about price. But I think to your point is that and this is the same language that we're hearing from the US and from Canada and here in Australia as well, is that one of the reasons that the global north has sort of missed this boat, that we are losing this competition to China, is because we have had too much regulation, and that what we need to do is to relax our permitting processes and indeed our environmental regulations, and that's of course very concerning. I don't know how far down that road Australia will go, and how much political resistance there will be to really, relaxing them to a point where you can kind of invest very quickly and build these sorts of big industrial parks. I don't think that's possible in Australia. I think we've gone too far. I would like to think so. And that's another reason why the politics of building out a downstream industry onshore that the Australian government still talks about, to me seems unrealistic when we have other options available in terms of regional partners that we can work with. To your point, it wasn't, this was Chinese companies investing, not just investing, but operating in Indonesia. So for the industrial park in Morowali, one of the big nickel industrial hubs, is sort of the whole park when there are multiple firms operating in the park, but many of them are either majority or partially owned by Chinese firms, and do joint operations with Indonesian firms. And one of the ministerial advisors that I was speaking with recently was sort of saying, I don't understand why Australia is so scared of Chinese investment. You just have to do joint operations with them, give them a share, you take a share, you still control your resources, they're still your assets. And this was sort of the Indonesian model could work here, but that's obviously up for debate. Did you want to add?
Yeah, I think regarding the financial or equity is it's quite interesting. And also I remember that in terms of mining, it has to be full ownership, right, on the paper.
51% at the actual mine?
Yeah,
Indonesian.
Indonesian 51. But rumor has it, rumor has it that financial capital play important role here, even though on the paper 51% owned by Indonesian, but we never know that 51%, probably half of the 51% comes from financial capital from Chinese Development Bank. Yeah, so someone has to do research on it.
And if we just continue that conversation, especially on Indonesia's resource nationalism and very aggressive strategy, it also comes with a price because it does push it really deeply into China's orbit. And right now, with geopolitical competition intensifying, it pushed it even further. We saw earlier this year LGES pull out from Karawang, for example, and also now Indonesia is scrambling to diversify it. For example, with regards to the ownership, they are trying to create a model that would escape US sanction, for example, right? So I was just wondering, with that very aggressive strategy that comes with a price, whether like what is the room for choices, not just for Indonesia, but Southeast Asia's Southeast Asian state in general when it comes to resources and making sure that their resource nationalism strategy is a success in the era of bifurcating global value chain. So I would like to ask two more from the audience. Yes, maybe the guy in the back and then Evelyn. Oh, okay. So can we start with Evelyn then?
Sorry, it's actually related to what Amir's just asked. I'm going to ask it a slightly different way. We're obviously moving into quite a sectoral discussion here, and there are many more sectors than this. But my question for Eve and Trissia is, given the sectors that you're talking about, would it be fair to say that relative to other sectors, such as advanced chip manufacturing, for example, these still remain relatively open sectors, not yet subject to the kind of demands for decoupling that we're seeing in some other sectors? And if that's the case, would it be fair to say that there remains room for maneuver within these still very vital sectors? But so I want a sort of sectoral specific sort of idea of this, if possible. Thank you.
You want to have one more? And we just tackle it.
Hi, I'm Hugo. I'm from the University of Melbourne. I'm currently taking the Master of Development Studies. My question is, well, right now we are seeing the rise of the government intervention in this resource, and with the neo-developmentalism, something like that. But will we see with this investment and financialization in this area, will we see another bubble burst again in economic burst again soon if the financialization and investment keep getting into this resources material? I think that's all.
Trissia, would you like to start and then we go to Eve?
Okay, so I want to respond to Evelyn's question first, whether it's still counted as open sector. In my case, are you referring to New 3 or nickel? Oh, Okay, Nutri. First, when it comes to Nutri, to my understanding, it's not really being open or not, but who is really capable of doing and investing and promoting these Nutri sectors. And this is also why Chinese gain prominence, gain an upper hand on this Nutri. And this is also why the Nutri become a new fix for China to solve its bubble burst in real estate infrastructure that they have been taking pride of for many decades. So if we still remember 10 years ago, BRI, there's a famous slogan that all policymakers across Southeast Asia also try to echo it. If you want to get rich, build the road. So that's what they also tend to polarize, and that's also why Indonesia chose China over Japan for the high-speed railway to get rich, but at the end went bankrupt. Yeah. Anyway, but there's also the same spirit that happening this day, that for you to become green but also can pursuing or promoting economic growth at the same time, let's thrive our Nutri sector. And it's just like coincidentally China gained an upper hand here. So for example, in terms of critical minerals, be it lithium or nickel, that are pivotal elements to these Nutri sectors. I think it's in the business world, it's a given. Even Japanese company admitted to it that China is the one who have the most advanced technology in extracting nickel, especially the low-grade nickel that is now located in Indonesia. And this is not being open or not, but it's more open. It's more about which one is feasible, who can do that, and who can solve our temporal crisis shock. And sorry, what's your name again? Hugo? Yeah, actually what you asked me, or you are from Melbourne, we can discuss it later. Have coffee in Melbourne. But actually what you asked me about this, will we see another round of bubble burst? Actually, that's also the very question that I asked to my colleague who had a seminar last month in Lantrop in Melbourne. Yeah, she's also one of geographer right now in University of Sydney. My colleague, my friend Leon Sinclair, who is right now doing critical mineral production network in Australia. And actually, I also try to reflect on myself. Within these 3 years, we are applying for ARC grant, external grants, and everything on a green transition. But during my PhD time, what I focus is on infrastructure financing. But now, in my time here as ECR, I'm focusing on green transition industrial policy. But also, I'm wondering what I'm going to write in my grant application in the next 3 years. So, but no one also give me any question. But what's striking here is that it means that the shift in our research, in our analytical focus, and also what's occupying the headline news, it means that what will be happening here also linked to what capitalist transformation in China will unfold in the next 3 years. So it's not necessarily about bubble burst in Southeast Asian economies, but I think it's more on Chinese side. So yeah, hopefully we can have, probably if Evelyn has more energy to do so, probably next year we can have something China, Southeast Asian things together. Yeah, that's all.
Did you get any of the grants?
Finger crossed.
I'm sure you will. So is it more open? Well, I mean, it sounds like it's more open, because if you were to put all the sort of policy rhetoric and strategic plans of the US, Canada, Australia, countries in Southeast Asia, Europe, and you put them all side by side, they are all planning on investing in onshore or friendshore downstream mineral processing and EV battery manufacturing and EV manufacturing. But I mean, we can't all make them, can we? Because where would we sell them? Who would buy them? And who would buy our very expensive ones? So I'm actually, and I'm not an economist, and I'm perplexed by this, and it's surely that won't work. So it is more open. But to Trissia's point, you know, the market will go to where it's, or the investment will end up going to where it is, the inputs are cheaper and the politics is more amenable, I feel. I don't know if that's an answer or not, but it's confusing, actually. Equally confusing is this bubble, and it depends what you're reading, because you can read reports that are extremely bullish and confidently giving us predictions of how much lithium we'll need to dig up and process and refine, and how much nickel and how much cobalt, modeled on, you know, this many EVs being purchased and this, and then you think, oh my God, this is like, this is, you know, it's booming. But then here in Australia, we're putting public money into our lithium mines, and we're trying to prop up the nickel sector because demand is actually depressed for now. But the idea is that the long-term demand is there. So I mean, I have no idea. I think economists also talk confidently about these things, but the truth is the information is partial, and there are so many variables, and China being the biggest one. So in short, I don't know.
All right, thank you so much. And I think from Trissia's presentations, we learned how the new tree especially create this link between Southeast Asia and China, especially tying Southeast Asia into China domestic strategy. And with Eve, we learn about how resource nationalism now is being used pervasively across the world, across global north and south as a tool for geopolitical positioning in a way, if you want to recast it that way. So shall we give a round of applause to these two? And thank you so much for your patience.